Recovery Kids. I hope you're having a great summer and that you've had a great week, enjoying the last bit of June. It's almost July, I can't believe it. We're going to keep going through the New Testament. And so if you remember last week, we learned about Jesus' dedication. If you remember, Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem at the temple to dedicate him. They offered a sacrifice for Jesus, their firstborn son. And while they were there, two people, Simeon and Anna, recognized Jesus as the Messiah. They rejoiced that God had finally sent his chosen Messiah to save his people, and they told other people in the temple about Jesus. And then, if you remember, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus went back home to Nazareth. So today we're going to learn about another thing that happened to Jesus while he was a child. And so pause and as a family, turn to Matthew 2. After Jesus was born, some wise men followed a star, and they ended up at King Herod's palace. And they asked King Herod, "Where is the one who is born the King of the Jews?" Well, as you can imagine, King Herod was not too happy about this. He summons his priests and the wise people and asks them, well, where would this King of the Jews be born? And they actually do come up with the right answer. They come up with the answer of Bethlehem. But then pause and as a family, see if you can figure out what Herod asked the wise men to do for him. Herod asks the wise men to come back to him and tell him where the Messiah was born, where Jesus was born, because Herod claimed that he also wanted to go and worship Jesus. Now that ends up not being true, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. But anyway, the wise men go to see Jesus, and they come bearing really, really fancy, expensive gifts fit for a king, like gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They worship Jesus, and then they return home. But they go home a different way. They don't go back to Herod because an angel of the Lord warned them not to go back home the same way, to see Herod. Now, back to Herod. I said that he didn't really want to worship Jesus. In fact, Herod had another plan that was a lot more evil. So pause it as a family, see if you can figure out what an angel of the Lord warned Joseph about and what Herod was planning to do. An angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph and told him that Herod was going to try to kill Jesus. So Joseph, Mary, and Jesus all leave their home in Nazareth to flee to Egypt to hide from Herod. So they stay there for a while, but after Herod dies, they return back to the land of Israel, back to Nazareth. So now we're going to kind of go forward a little bit in Jesus' life. So now, pause and as a family, turn to Luke 2:41. So we've now gone ahead of time, and we're going to a time when Jesus was 12 years old. Now when Jesus was 12, him and his family went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover festival. And this is something they would have done every year. And this is something that would have been done in a large group. It wouldn't have been just Mary, Joseph, and Jesus traveling. It probably would have been a large group from Nazareth all traveling together. Well, on their way home, Jesus ends up not being with the group. Now, Joseph and Mary just assume that Jesus is somewhere in this large party of traveling people. But after a day of travel, they start to look around for him and they realize that he's not with them. Jesus is still somewhere in Jerusalem. As you can imagine, this was really probably very frightening for them, as some of your parents can probably attest to if they've ever temporarily lost sight of you in a store. It can be very scary for parents when they suddenly realize that they don't know exactly where their child is. And now this isn't just losing a child in a store temporarily. This is a child is back in a whole nother city. So Joseph and Mary turn around and head back to Jerusalem to look for Jesus. And once they arrive in Jerusalem, they begin searching everywhere. So pause it as a family, see if you can figure out how long it was before Mary and Joseph found Jesus, and when they found Jesus, where was he? 3 days before Jesus was found by Mary and Joseph. Can you imagine how scary that would have been for Mary and Joseph? But when they found Jesus, Jesus was in the temple. And he was in the temple listening to the teachers there and asking questions of them. And everyone who listened to him were amazed by how much knowledge and wisdom Jesus had. Now, if you think about it, this is really impressive because if you remember, Jesus is only 12, but these teachers and priests and scribes are people who have probably been studying the Bible, or at least the Old Testament, their entire lives. So Mary and Joseph find Jesus and they essentially ask him, why did you do this? Why did you not come home with us? And essentially you really scared us. So pause and as a family, see if you can figure out what Jesus says in response to Mary and Joseph's question. Now, Jesus responds to Mary and Joseph and essentially says, why are you surprised by this? Didn't you know that I needed to be in my Father's house? Now, to us who are familiar with Jesus' identity as the Son of God, that makes sense. But Mary and Joseph are still wrapping their minds around this idea that Jesus is God's son, so they're kind of confused by this statement. And then they return home together to Nazareth, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and Jesus begins to grow up. He begins to grow physically, taller, like you and I would, and he also begins to grow in knowledge and wisdom of God. And the Bible tells us that he grew in favor with God and with people. Or in other words, God approved of him and other people approved of him and were impressed by him. So what does this have to do with us? Well, Jesus was only 12, but he was already learning about God's word and trying to begin having a deeper and deeper relationship with God. And even though you may be younger than 12, you're never too young to start learning about God's word, and you're never too young to be used by God as a part of his plan. And studying the Bible is a marathon, it's not a sprint. In other words, you can't read the Bible once and know everything the Bible has to say perfectly. It's something you read over and over again and study more and more. Now, you're sitting there and you may be thinking, well, that seems pretty overwhelming. That's a really big job. I mean, the Bible, after all, is a very thick book. But what's important is taking little steps to understand the Bible more and more. So, my challenge for you all this week is a challenge that we've done before. I challenge you to memorize one verse of the Bible. It could be any verse. Now, some of you older kids may be thinking smart and thinking, well, I'm going to memorize the verse that just says Jesus wept. Okay, you can do that, but try to challenge yourself a little bit and pick at least a little bit longer of a verse than just Jesus wept. And if that seems too easy for you, if you want to push yourself even further, maybe try memorizing the Old Testament books of the Bible or the New Testament books of the Bible. But just take some step this week towards understanding God's word even better. Well, that's all I have for you, Calvary Kids. Until next time, see ya.